Hi everyone and welcome to Miss Estruch Teach and Tell, and in this video I'm going to be going through flipped learning. So I'm going to be talking about what flipped learning is, how you can implement it in your lessons, and why it might be a good idea to try it out. So a bit of context, I did a research project with the University of Cambridge with CamStar, and I did this quite a few years ago now, and I did my initial research project with year 12 classes, and then I extended it further and did it with year 9 classes as well. So I'm going to be sharing with you the research that I collected with A-level, GCSE as well, but also demystifying some of the research that's out there, summarising it into this short video so that you can take away what flipped learning is, when it's going to be best to use it, what obstacles you might have, how to overcome those obstacles, and the key takeaways to give you the best possible lessons for your students. So let's get into it. And don't forget, if you do want to download any of these resources, I'll link them in the description below. So let's jump into it then, and let me talk through what is flipped learning if you're not familiar, how to use it, and why I think it is really useful to use in certain situations. So let's begin then with what is flipped learning. Traditional learning is where you'd have the teacher teaching all the theory, teaching all the information, and then for homework, students might do some exam questions or some sort of activity to apply their knowledge of that lesson. Flipped learning is where we swap that over. So for homework, students learn the information, and then in the lesson, you spend time testing their understanding, applying that to difficult situations, applying that to exam questions, and generally doing more activities. So the idea behind flipped learning is all of these things here. The benefits should be that you have a more dynamic lesson. It's not just chalk and talk. Instead, it's more activity based. You get students reflecting on what they have understood because they've had to learn it at home. It's a more interactive lesson. They're challenged more in the lesson. They're taught to independently learn. You get feedback in real time because once they're doing the activities there and then, you can see whether they did or didn't understand it rather than having to wait until you mark the homework. You are able to formatively assess them as well, and you see the visible progress. So these are all the suggested advantages of flipped learning. So I came across this a number of years ago now when I was noticing that some of my lessons were just chalk and talk because I had to try and get through the theory and I knew it wasn't challenging my students enough. So I wanted to do some research in both year 12 for A-level and year 9 for the start of GCSE to try and overcome these particular challenges. So the challenges that I had in year 12 was I had large classes, there were mixed ability, and I felt that I was spending way too much time just talking at them about the content rather than focusing on practicals and also skills that are essential for the A-level. Because the A-level, 50% almost of the A-level paper is application skills. Year 9, my challenge was I only saw the class once a week, and that meant there was a lot of GCSE content, because we start GCSE in year 9 at my school, to cram into 1 hour a week. So again, a lot of the lesson was just theory, very little time for practical and skills. So I'd done some initial research on this, and I'd done some very, very brief trials in my lessons. So I wanted to then develop this further to see, could I use flipped learning to reduce the amount of time at A-level and GCSE that I am just talking at and teaching the students the theory, and therefore spend more time teaching them the exam technique and the skills and the practicals that are potentially going to help them to get those highest grades. So what were my initial concerns? Because let's face it, you've probably heard that and thought that all sounds great. However, and then you've come up with some concerns just like I did. My first concern was, this is great, but am I reinventing the wheel here? Because I've got all my lessons planned. It's going to take me hours to recreate them and flip them on their head. Is it worth it? My other concern was, are the students or even maybe the parents going to think they don't need me anymore as a teacher, or what is the value of me as a teacher if they are teaching themselves the theory at home? So I was worried that I might get some backlash from students or parents that I'm not teaching them the theory. The other big concern, which is a major one for people, is what do you do in the situation where the students don't do the homework? Because if the homework was to learn the theory, and then they've come to the lesson without the homework, what are you going to do? And as I said, also, where am I getting the time from to actually prepare all of these resources? So those were some of my initial concerns. And from doing this research, this is actually what I found. My first concern, as I said, was what if the teacher becomes redundant or you get backlash from parents or students? And what I actually found was doing flipped learning made students appreciate me more as a teacher and realise that they did actually need me. Because when they learnt the content at home, I always started the lesson with, come up with something that maybe you weren't as clear on, and there was always something that they put on their whiteboard that they tried to understand themselves and they didn't. So I knew that that would be something to address in the lesson. And it really made them realise that coming to lessons was valuable, having a teacher was valuable, and they can't do it by themselves fully. The next one was, what if the student doesn't do the work? Now, I actually found that students were more likely to do this work for homework than traditional homework. And I found that only 3 students out of the 12 lessons didn't do the work. And yes, I know it's going to vary from school to school depending on the cohorts that you have. But even students that normally don't like to do homework or refuse to do it, they find it too hard, they leave it, they were more inclined to do it for a couple of reasons. The first one was that it's easy to do. If you're told to watch a video and answer some questions, that's much easier to do than having to answer some exam questions, for example. So the students who sometimes don't do the homework because they're worried about failing, they were doing this homework because they realised they couldn't really fail at it. They were just making notes or watching a video. So they felt a lot more confident and secure and started to do their homework. The other thing I found was the students that were just doing it out of pure laziness. At my school, what that meant was the students that didn't do it compared to everyone else who had realised that they then had to really struggle through that lesson because they were the only ones that didn't know what was going on and everyone else did. They felt quite embarrassed and silly, which I'm not saying is a good thing to make a student feel that way, of course. But that was the impact it had on some students, that they felt embarrassed they hadn't done the work that others had. And therefore, they just didn't do it again. They made sure that they did do the work the next time. What if they don't do it properly as well? The ones that didn't do it properly, and by that I mean maybe they just skimmed it, didn't put enough effort in. This kind of links to the one above. The ones that hadn't done it in enough detail, so maybe didn't write thorough notes, they found that they struggled in the lesson and others weren't struggling, and they didn't like that feeling of struggle, so they made sure next time they did match the effort of everyone else. Now, linked to the idea as well, sometimes people are worried about what if the students are going to embed a misconception. Well, that's why at the start of every lesson I always did mini whiteboards and just said anything that you weren't clear on, and I got them to write it down. Or if there were things that I know students often are confused about or misconceptions can arise, I would start with a mini whiteboard quiz, questioning those topic areas, looking at the answers, and at that point I could address the misconceptions to the class as a whole and get them to correct their notes at that point. Lastly, would it take hours to create all the new resources? So what I found was I edited what I already had in place. So what I would typically set as a homework, I edited to then become the classwork, and vice versa. PowerPoints that I'd usually use in the lesson to teach the theory, I slightly edited it to give prompts to students, and then I set that as the homework. So it was some work, it was, and I did a little bit of editing. It was actually also the reason why I started my YouTube channel, was because of flipped learning, which obviously took hours to make those videos, but those are now all in place so you can use them to set as flipped learning lessons for students to do at home. So the last thing I pointed out here was, yes, it did take time to recreate these lessons, but I found it was offset by the amount of time I now wasn't spending marking. So instead, they were doing these exam questions and lessons, and I could give them live individual feedback, just going round to students, speaking to them, and also whole class feedback. So instead of having written feedback, a lot of it was given as verbal instead. So let me just show you some of the things that I would do for the homework that I would set compared to the lesson work. So this was for Year 9 GCSE for AQA Biology. And when they were learning about the heart and the blood, I set them homework that would cover the next couple of lessons, because we have a homework timetable, so it had to fit around when I was allowed to set them homework. So I asked them to print out 4 activities, which I'll show you. And then I linked 3 GCSE pod videos that I wanted them to watch, and I gave the exact times to watch it. Now, if you don't have GCSE Pod, you could pick YouTube videos, for example, that you've checked beforehand that they are appropriate. So this was one of them. Once they watched a GCSE Pod video, instead of just saying make notes, because I think that's not specific enough for a year 9 to be able to know what to do, I gave them this grid to complete as their notes. So for the 4 components of the blood, describe the structure and then give the function. For blood vessels, I then gave them this table, so they had to label the blood vessels, state the name of each vessel, and describe the structure, although obviously there's a typo there. So again, not just saying make notes, it was very prescriptive what they had to do. The last one to do with the circulatory system, again, it was a diagram to label, key things to answer or add in. So the students found this easy to complete because it was watching the videos and then not even just writing their own notes, it was labeling, answering questions that I knew the video answered. So then what I did was, when they came to the first lesson, to check their understanding, to check that they had the key information or some of the key information, I started off with this mini whiteboard quiz and I said, use your homework to answer these 7 questions. And this straight away, it took about 10 minutes. It enabled me to see which students had done the homework, maybe which students hadn't done the homework to a high enough quality, because they would be the ones that couldn't answer these questions. So I'd go around and speak to them one-on-one, talk about the importance of doing the work, because now they can't fully engage. And also it gave me a chance to check the level of detail they had in their notes without having to collect it all in and mark it, because I could give the whole class verbal feedback. It then meant, instead of spending loads of lesson time talking through the theory, getting the students to write down notes, we could do more challenging questions. Now, for the students that I was teaching, they are top ability students. So we're talking about all of them are grade 7 to 9 target grade. So this would be the level of challenge appropriate for my students. But if you have students with lower target grades, lower ability, then you can still do challenging questions for them, but you'd need to just differentiate it according to their needs. But for me, I was able to give them data like this, challenging questions to really improve their skills linked to data analysis and exam technique. And here's another example. When we came onto the heart, their homework was to watch the GCSE Pod video and they had to label the diagram and annotate on a few of these key concepts. And then at the start of the lesson, to check they'd understood it, I projected this image up on the whiteboard and I said to identify what all of the numbered structures were. That then meant most of the lesson I could focus on the challenging types of exam question that come up. So here are some examples. So my results then that I found were, first of all, when looking at the mean proportion of time for the different assessment objectives, here is the mean proportion of time before I did flipped learning. So my traditional type of lesson. And as I felt, I was correct that most of my lesson time was spent on AO1, which is just giving out information, students writing notes. And there was a significant difference between the time I spent on AO1 compared to AO3, which was more the practical side of things as well. So I then compared this to the mean proportion of lesson time spent on AO1 and AO2 and AO3. I actually combined those to compare as a comparison to AO1 with and without flipped learning. So here's my AO1 without and with flipped learning. And we can see that there is a big difference in the mean. Obviously, we've got about 55% compared to 22% of the lesson time. And even when we take into the statistic that I did, there was a significant difference between the amount of time spent, and it was significantly lower. When I then compared the amount of time spent on AO2 and 3 without flipped learning compared to with, this was the bit where there was the biggest difference. We can see that there is significantly more lesson time was spent on AO2 and AO3. And in fact, about 80% of the lesson time was based on developing their skills linked to application, practicals, processing data. So I was really pleased to see that the flipped learning did achieve what I wanted it to achieve. But I also got some student feedback to see what they thought of this flipped learning. And most of it was actually really positive. The students said that they liked doing the learning at home because they felt more prepared for a lesson and they understood what was going on in the lesson. They felt more challenged. They actually said they enjoyed the lessons more because instead of just sitting there being talked at and writing notes, almost the entire lesson was activity based, and they really enjoyed that interactive and active style of lesson. They said they felt more comfortable asking questions, which for me was such an important one that I hadn't even considered would be a positive. They said that because they were teaching themselves the work at home, it felt like it wasn't embarrassing to say if they hadn't understood something. Whereas in the traditional lesson, if I had taught them it, they felt embarrassed to ask because, number one, they said they felt like they might offend me because they hadn't understood it when I taught them. But also they said they felt they should have understood it because they'd been taught by a teacher. So I was so pleased that this actually meant that the students were more comfortable asking me questions and just saying when they hadn't understood something, and they didn't feel like there was any negative behind asking. The main downside though was the students did say the homework took a long time. So I think maybe when I was doing the homework that would last for flipped learning for a few lessons, it probably was taking them maybe an hour, hour and a half, which was far too long for a year 9 student. So that would be something just to consider, just the length of time that you think the homework might take them. So obstacles then, because so far this all sounds amazing. The students liked it. I got the result that I want. So why isn't everyone doing flipped learning? I've done this inset at my school for teachers multiple times. I do this as a training session for the PGCE students, the ECT students. I've even presented it for Cambridge University with CamStart as well. And I always get the same feedback, and that's the obstacles. Number one is teachers are incredibly busy. And I am very aware of that because I'm a teacher as well. And if you've already got lessons planned, resources in place, then it's really hard to want to change what you've got because you're too busy. Also, it could link to finances, because to get GCSE Pod, for example, that's a paid for resource. And if you want to buy in resources like that so you don't have to use YouTube, which has adverts, then that can be expensive. And then just generally the time it takes is obviously going to be a big obstacle. So the recommendations that I said were that for staff to do flipped learning, I do think there needs to be training and guidance around it. So things I've talked through today, for example. I also don't think all lessons need to be flipped. And in some cases, I don't think they should be flipped, because there are some topics which are just really difficult. And there are so many misconceptions that I do feel they should still be traditionally taught by the teacher. I'd also say to consider how to assess the flipped homework, because for me, I did it mainly through assessing with the mini whiteboards at the start, and I'd quickly go around at the beginning of the lesson to check that everyone had completed it while they were answering the questions on the whiteboard. But the students are going to still need some feedback on their homework. So just consider how you're going to assess it. I, as I said, mainly did it as whole class feedback and verbal feedback, but consider how that would fit in with your school marking policy. And lastly, you have to make sure you've got incredibly explicit homework instructions. Not just watch a video, make notes, give them the exact video, maybe even the exact time in the video to watch. And as you saw, not just saying make notes, give them a mind map to complete, or a grid or a table. So it's really explicit what they need to do. So here are a few things that could work for other subjects, not just science. So we've got a video demonstration use of new maths formula and the student tries 3 examples. Or students learn a set of vocabulary for French or other foreign languages. Students maybe read ahead of a chapter in a novel and use simple questions to check they've understood it, which I imagine English teachers probably do already. Read a practical method and highlight different variables and hazards to get ready for a practical. It could be labeling diagrams. It could be turning a paragraph of text into an image, or vice versa. So lots of different ideas of what you could set as flipped learning. Now I'm going to link this in the description because, as I said, I did this as a research project for Cambridge University. So if you want to have a look at any of the research that I used to underpin how I designed my homework, designed my lessons and the theory behind it, then you can have a deep dive into that if you want to have a go at this yourself. So that is it. I hope you found it helpful, and I really hope you give flipped learning a try. If you do, let me know in the comments how it went for you, or if you come across any obstacles or you need some ideas, you're stuck, then put it in the comments and I'll get back to you for help.